episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Before we start, obviously anything that I do say in this week's episode of the show is are wholly my own comments and have no bearing or relevance to the company that employs me. Not that I'm going to say anything unpleasant, but just get the disclaimer in there first, just to be on the safe side. As you probably know, January in the whisky industry is, generally speaking, pretty much a quiet month. For most sort of distilleries and independent bottling companies, it's a case of, January is a time where you go and plan the sort of the forthcoming year's releases, all that kind of thing, and so as soon as you come along to February, it's all right. Whoosh! Out come all the samples, and I mean, I think I've tasted more samples this month than I can remember. In actual fact, it just seems to be everybody is suddenly sort of bringing out new releases, which is good. Certainly need them. The shelves are a little bit bare of classy independent bottling, so it's always nice to start receiving the samples and putting in orders and stuff. So today, another episode on Lady of the Glen. I mean, I've done, this is possibly, could be about the 5th, 6th maybe episode of the show that I've done on Lady of the Glen. On the whole, I've been impressed by what they've been doing, the casks that they've been releasing, and certainly the first quarter release, which we'll be looking at today, certainly is no less interesting than any of their previous releases. So there's not really a great deal to say about Lady of the Glen, as I've said a lot about them in past episodes of the show. So let's just take a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to start with the oldest bottling that they have released this month. This is a 34-year-old Invergordon. It's refill bourbon barrel 1480, distilled in January of 1988, bottled in January of this year at 48.9%. So always nice to start with a nice old grain. Then we're going to move on to an Aultmore. This is a 12-year-old Aultmore, an ex-refill wine barrique, 305145, distilled in June of 2009, again bottled in January of this year at 54.5%. Next bottling we'll be looking at is Benriach. Now, you don't see an awful lot of privately bottled Benriachs these days. Once upon a time they were relatively ubiquitous, but nowadays they're very, very few and far between. So again, another refill ex-wine barrique, 800-341. It's a 12-year-old. It was distilled again in June of 2009, bottled in January of this year at 57.2%. Then we're going to move on to a Daluean. This is a 13-year-old Daluean, originally matured in a refill hogshead, finished in an ex-Pedro Ximenez cask, 303813, distilled in March of 2008, bottled obviously in January this year at 53.7%. Tobermory time, yes. Right, so this is a 10-year-old Tobermory, aged in refill ex-Tawny Port cask, or Tawny Port cask finish, I should say, sorry. Cask number 7006, distilled in November of 2011, so would appear to be post-clean-up, shall we say. And bottled in January of this year, so bottled at 56.5%. And the final bottling we'll be looking at is a new blend that Hannah Whisky Merchants obviously own Lady of the Glen range. This is obviously not bottled in the Lady of the Glen range. This is a standalone bottling in its own right, and they've called it St Bridget's Kirk blended Scotch malt whisky, batch number 1. It is a vatting of 3 casks, a 2015 Culila Sherry Hogshead, a 2013 Culila Refill Hoggy, and one 2009 unnamed Islay from a refill barrel. So as you can see, whoops, pretty heavily sherry coloured. So it'll be interesting to see whether it's just purely peat and sherry. So this was so the youngest is obviously from 2015, making it technically a 6-year-old, and bottled at 48.5. So I think that should be an interesting one to finish on. So let's kick off with a bit of Invergordon then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's see what 34-year-old Invergordon's like then, shall we? Classic, crisp, fresh, quite light. Often, like I said, I often find Invergordon to be at the sort of the lighter end of the grain whisky spectrum. There's some nice maturity here. There's some oxidised fruit. It's more in the sort of like sultanery, sort of dried citrus end, dried apricot end of the spectrum, as opposed to the sort of the heavy raisinated end of the spectrum. A little bit of toasty oak, a little bit of coconut. Yeah, I mean that's a nice nose. I mean it's showing some maturity, as you would expect at this age, but still nice balance between that maturity and the sort of like the vibrancy and the fresh crisp fruit. Yeah, nice nose. Let's see what the palate like. Again, light, crisp, white fruits, a little grainy nip to start off with, and then the oak moves in. The oak's got a lovely sweetness to it, vanilla. The alcohol is really nice. It's got a lovely level of alcohol. It's kind of emphasising that sort of grain intensity, that grainy nip on the mid palate. It's good long finish. Oxidised fruit returning, along with a little bit of the oak, although the oak kind of like tails off to a certain extent on the mid palate, so you are getting plenty of sort of mature-ish grain character on the finish. But all told, I think that's really nice. Now, I mean that's retailing at sort of about £146, which is quite a lot of money. But again, it's 34 years old, and you compare that to a 34-year-old single malt, and well, you easily double, if not sort of like 2.5 times the price of that. So I still think that grain whisky is amazing value for money, and that certainly is a lovely one to start with. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Daluean. So refill wine barrique. Lot of juicy red fruit. It's got that sort of rich, slightly malty Aultmore character, but there's a sort of almost a salinity there, sort of a citrus, sort of mineral salinity kind of note, which is really nice. It's balancing up that wininess. I mean, the balance, like I said, is pretty good. I mean, I'm certainly getting what I would expect from Aultmore. I'm getting that sort of malty character, and it's really quite pleasantly balanced. Not too much of the wine. It's just, like I said, adding that sort of lovely juicy sort of red fruit note. So that's right. Pretty much like the nose, in actual fact. Again, really well balanced. I'm getting the maltiness, the richness of the Daluean character, a little bit of red fruits, a little bit of spice, a touch of barley, a little bit of a herbal note as well, just kind of coming through on the aftertaste. It's a touch masked, so I'm going to put a little drop of water with it just to see what that does to it. But again, it's really pleasantly balanced. The finish is harmonious. It's not sort of OTT. Now the sort of putting a little drop of water is knocking back the wine notes, you know, quite a bit. So I'm getting more of the barley, a little bit more citrus, more of that sort of maltiness, touch of cereal as well. That's a lovely nose. Again, let's see what it passes like now. Again, pretty much like the nose. Less wine notes now, more spirit character, more maltiness, more richness, really nice length, lovely spiciness on the finish and the aftertaste. So again, lovely whiskey. 82 quid. Well, yes, again, this seems to be about sort of like your price point now for a 12-year-old cask strength whiskey. 82 quid, 70 odd quid for sort of like a 10-year-old. This is the current norm, you know. Yes, it's quite pricey, but I think that really delivers well. So that's a lovely bottling. Right, okay, let's move on to the Benriach. So again, another refill wine barrique. Let's see if the balance is as good as the balance on the Aultmore. Again, I would say so. A lot less of the wine cask. It's malty, it's toffeed, it's coffee. It's got more of an edginess. Now, I often find that with Benriach, that it has quite an edgy character. I mean, I was never a huge fan of the older distillery releases. Certainly, I thought the 10-year-old was a bit, the 12-year-old was a bit, It seemed to me, certainly with the older range, I mean, I know it's all changed now since the changeover, but it really never kind of came into its own until it was sort of like at least about mid-teens. But this is really quite nice. Again, it's balanced. It's a little bit more nettily, herbal, slightly more astringent. There's a little bit of vanilla, which is softening. But I like the tartness of the winey red fruits. It's kind of got a, like I say, it's got an edginess, but it's not a sort of like a dirty edginess. It's just edgy, if you see what I mean. I wouldn't quite go as far as saying it's vibrant, but it's got that edge to it, which is quite intriguing. Let's see what the pass like now. It certainly feels a little bit more mature than 12 years of age. I mean, it's got that sort of maltiness, again, slightly edgy, herbal, tart red fruit, quite drying, oxidised fruit on the mid palate, which is kind of giving a sort of feeling that it's actually older than what it actually is. A little bit of peat on the finish. I didn't get any peat on the nose, but there's certainly a sort of slightly earthy, peaty kind of subtlety right on the finish and on the aftertaste. Again, really nicely balanced. Alcohol is well contained. I will put a little drop of water and see what that does to it, but I don't really feel that it actually needs any water at all. Right, again, like on the Aultmore, it's kind of pushed back the winey notes, and now I'm getting that kind of Weetabix cereal, bran flakes, malt character. It's a bit like sort of a breakfast malt, really, I suppose. Yeah, the red fruits are subtler, but they're a little bit sweeter, a little bit more aromatic. It's kind of lost that little edge to it, it has to be said. So I'll pass on now. Again, a bit like the nose in actual fact. It's kind of lost some of that wine cask influence. It's more cereal, Weetabix, bran flakes, malt. Still quite a little edgy. The tartness of this fruit really comes through on the aftertaste now. Slight minerality as well. Touch of earth. Not getting so much of that peat note now. That seems to have kind of disappeared. A little bit more expensive than the Aultmore, about 90 quid. So yeah, you are sort of like sharp intake of breath on this one, and I must admit I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Benriach. Sometimes I find it really nice, and this one is to me really quite pleasant. Sometimes I'm not quite so keen on it, but this, yeah, I like this. This is a good bottling. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Daluean. So refill hogshead, PX cask finish. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? A lot of sherry. Heavy sherry. Treacle, dried grape. More treacle, more dried grape. Yeah, not a great deal of anything else actually. Little bit of vanilla. Yeah, it's got a sort of maltiness to it. It's kind of, it's not totally floating my boat, it has to be said. It's a little bit sort of oak-centric. It certainly lacks the balance of the previous two, in my personal opinion. But, you know, in saying that, the sherry is very clean. There's going to be a lot of people that like this kind of style. So, you know, again, it's 90 quid. It's the same price as the Benriach, but you know, if I was given the choice of the two, certainly I would be more inclined towards the Benriach. See what pass like. Treacly, silky, juicy. Again, lots of PX character, lots of dried fruit, treacly dried fruit, a little bit of American oak just coming through on the mid palate and the finish. Yeah, it's got a feeling of weight, a feeling of that Daluean sort of heaviness, but again, no real sort of characteristics from the spirit other than that. And so, you know, we are in the oak end of the spectrum, and there's a bit of a pleasant spicy flourish on the finish, but it's not really doing a great deal for me, it has to be said. Like I said, it kind of lacks the balance to a certain extent of the previous two, and is just a little too heavy on the sherry. But then again, like I said, there's, you know, some people will absolutely love that. So okay, so let's move on to the Tobermory, my old nemesis. Now, I mean, you may well remember, I can't remember how long ago, wasn't it? Quite some time ago, I did an episode of the show on Tobermory to sort of kind of expound upon my my theory that somewhere around about 2008 the distillery kind of cleaned up its spirit, and certainly, if you remember from that tasting, it certainly implied that was the case. So anyway, so this technically should be modern leche, as opposed to sort of old-fashioned stinky cabbagey leche. Anyway, let's see. Now, I'm going to say something you don't often hear me say, and that's, damn, that's a bloody good leche. It's how it should be. You know, it's smoked meat, it's earth, quite pungent peat, but it's clean. There's some maltiness. There's some there's a little bit of kind of tawny fruit, but again, not a great deal. The tawny cask finish is subtle. It's got a slight herbal note, but it's clean. That's what it's all about. And this is, to me, you know, this is what leche should be all about that sort of smoked meat, and less of that sort of cardboardy kind of faintiness and general unpleasantness. And this is one of the best leches I think I've ever come across. And, you know, again, it's not cheap. It's 94 quid. Don't quite know why leche is quite so expensive, but I'll tell you what, from the nose alone, I'm impressed. See what that's like. sooty, malty, intense, clean as a whistle in actual fact. Astringent herbal peat, touch of the tawny fruit, again very subtle, really lovely intensity, and like I said, this is how Ledaig should be. It should have that lovely smoked meaty kind of character without any of the associated sulphur and faints and what have you, and that is absolutely stunning. It's 56.5%. Just need a quick check on that. I don't think it needs any water. I love the intensity of it when it's neat. But I'm going to put a little drop of water just to kind of see what happens to it. Okay, so it's a little sulphur note now, a little spirit sulphur note. Which I can forgive that. I mean, you know, this is, like I said, putting a little drop of water with it. So, you know, if you want to avoid that, just don't put any water with it. It's still got that lovely peatiness. The peat hasn't kind of like fallen off a cliff and just left sort of sulphury, cardboardy spirit. It's still got that cleanliness. Maybe there's a touch more of the tawny dried fruits, but I still think overall that's a very, very impressive nose. Let's see what the palate's like. Subtler peat, a little sweeter in actual fact, a little bit more barley character. Quite coffeed now in actual fact. Still that underlying meatiness. The meatiness is not quite so sort of prevalent and in your face. The peat is softened a bit, but still there's a good amount there. It's slightly herbal. I like that. I'm impressed. I'm more than happy to sell that to anybody that if you know, I was talking from a retailer's point of view, which obviously I can't, but read between the lines. Yeah, I like that. I'm impressed, and this is the thing about sort of tasting bottlings from distilleries that you probably don't have such a particularly high opinion of, because you just want to be surprised. Every now and again you want to go, actually, that's a very good bottling, and it again plays into my theory that Ledaig cleaned up its spirit somewhere around about 2008, because this is just proof of that in my opinion, and all the much better for it, shall we say. So, although I'm not at this point ready to sort of say Ledaig, or Tobermory as the distillery is called, out of the axis of evil just yet, but you never know. Right, okay, so on to the final bottling of this afternoon, which is the St Bridget's Kirk blended malt. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Okay, it's quite heavily sherried. It's marketed as such, and then they're not wrong about that. Plenty of dried fruit, chocolate, astringent medicinal peat, dark marzipan, prune, dried apricot, raisin, black pepper, black coffee. I mean, it is what it is. I like it. I mean, yeah, all right, you can say there's very little Kalila kind of character coming through, and it is pretty much peat and sherry, but there's a kind of time and a place for a bit of peat and sherry, I think. I mean, again, you know, ignore the fact it's a 6-year-old. Yes, it's 56 quid, but just focus on the quality. The quality is really very, very good. You know, and if you like, I mean, it's got that kind of old school freshness to it. I mean, sort of, you know, Kalila, modern Kalila is a lot more oily and heavier than it used to be, certainly. A lot heavier and oilier than it was 20 odd years ago. But this is kind of got an element of throwback character to it. It's got a freshness. It's got a sort of a real kind of lovely saltiness, and yeah, all right, okay. Like I said, it's peat and sherry essentially, but it's fun. It's great. It's fun. It really is. Let's see what the pal's like. Intense sherry. The peat is kind of, or it's taking a bit of a back seat to the sherry. It has to be said. It's got sweetness to it. The saltiness of the spirit kind of balances that sort of sherry sweetness. It's got a lovely length, real pepperiness, a little bit of almost coconut kind of coming through on the aftertaste. The American oak is kind of coming through right on the end. In actual fact, I think the finish is kind of my favourite part of this whiskey. It's got a lovely kind of intensity, a sort of, there's a slight kind of almost tamarind kind of bitterness, sort of, bitter sort of citric kind of note. It finishes fresh and clean, and it's got a lovely progression, and that's, to me, that's one of the things obviously I look for from a spirit, is the progression of, throughout the flavours. Am I starting at one point and finishing at another? And to me, it has interest. It's not kind of delivering everything in one go and just staying practically the same throughout. It is developing and evolving on the palate. And all right, at the end of the day, yes, you can say it is pretty much peat and sherry, but there is a nuance to it as well. There's a little bit more going on. Not a huge amount of distillery character, I will give you that, but there's plenty of sort of secondary and tertiary flavours coming through, just enough to make that really interesting. Yeah, okay, so like I said, for a 6-year-old spirit, it is quite pricey at 56 quid. But just forget about the 6-year-old bit. Just to, if you focus just purely on the spirit itself and what it's delivering and how pleasant it is, I think the price is a tad high. I mean, I would love to have seen that at just a shade under 50 quid. I think sort of like, if that was hitting the shelf at 49.95, it would be an absolute killer, really would. But as such, it can't do. Well, I mean, not unless I'm practically giving it away. If I was retailing it, that is. But of course, I'm personally not. But yeah, I think sort of price aside, I think quality really very, very impressive. So lovely one to finish on, I think. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, as per usual, a really big thank you to Gregor and to Hannah Whisky Merchants and to Paul at Hannah Whisky Merchants for sending the samples. Hopefully, you guys don't think I've done a particularly bad job of reviewing the releases. I've been honest at the end of the day, and I think overall I'm still a big fan of what they're bottling. I think their cask selection, certainly since I've been regularly tasting their releases, has got better. It's got more what's the word? More consistent in the quality. I mean, yes, all right, there are one or two that I'm maybe not quite so keen on, but certainly I think that there's the balance between sort of like the very interesting and good bottlings is now vastly outweighing some of the slightly more iffy releases that they have made over the last few years, and so. The Invergordon, yeah, I mean, it's kind of classic Invergordon. It's that lighter end of the grain whisky spectrum. It's got a lovely maturity in sort of age terms, not necessarily in sort of spirit terms, because obviously, as we know, this would have kept going on and on. So you kind of pick your point for sort of bottling a grain whiskey, I suppose, and lovely, really nice, worth the money, I think. The Aultmore, really nicely balanced. When you sort of look at the sort of, you get sent through the list of what's been done, and you sort of look at all these kind of like wine cask finished, wine cask matured, sherry cask finished, all that kind of stuff. You're thinking, but I think, hats off. I think that Daluean was well finished, not too heavy on the wine, really nicely balanced. And pretty much you can say exactly the same thing about the Benriach. Yeah, okay, it's a little on the pricey side, I will give you that, but it's a lovely whiskey. And it's just interesting to see that although both of these bottlings have been finished or matured in wine barriques, you get the characteristics of the distilleries coming through quite loud. I mean, they are very distinctly different from each other, and that's what you want. You don't want sort of like homogeny. You don't want sort of oh, this is just tasting of a wine cask. The Daluean for me, again, plus points, clean, minus points, oak. Just overly oaky, no real distillery character for me personally. But if that's your kind of thing, then it's good. No off notes, no sulphur, no anything. Aside from the cleanliness and the sherry character. Star of the show has to be the Ledaig, Lecce, I should say. Sorry, it purely, I suppose, because it's how Lecce should be, which is why it's the star, if you see what I mean. I think the quality of it is as good as the quality of everything else that I'd tasted up until that point, and including the St. Bridget's Kirk. But it's kind of like, as I said, when you have such a strong feeling about a specific distillery, and if that strong feeling is towards the negative end of the spectrum, then you're always pleasantly surprised when something really very, very good comes along. And yeah, alright, so like I said, sort of 94, 95 quid, expensive for a 10-year-old whiskey, but if you want the taste of Lecce how it should taste, then that's a really lovely bottling to go for. And the St. Bridget's Kirk, I mean, yes, alright, at the end of the day it is peat and sherry. I know a lot of people that love peat and sherry, and I love peat and sherry, it has to be said. It's one of those things where I'm quite happy to go, well, all right, I can't taste any distillery character, but I like the peat and I like the sherry. It's kind of, not always at the end of the day, but I think sort of, it's not something I would always want to drink, but I think there's more going on than just the peat and the sherry. There is certainly some nuance, not a great deal of distillery character, but nuance within the actual spirit itself, which is a plus point. And I must admit I quite enjoyed that. So yeah, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Hopefully this will be sort of the first of a number of episodes of the show on new releases rather than sort of things that I kind of fancy. But then in saying that, there's always episodes that I've got planned in advance for that I've just fancied doing. And so big thank you to Lady of the Glen, to Anna Whisky Merchants for the samples for today's episode of the show. Like I said, I hope you're not disappointed by my review. It's an honest review, and like I said, I think each of them has its have their plus points. So yeah. Anyway, until next week, all I can say is good afternoon and good dramming. Heavy as a rock, fragile as a top.